Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Nina Rozman dan ini Niaga AWANI. Pada Khamis, Bursa Malaysia ditutup pada paras tertinggi hariannya namun kekal kukuh melebihi paras 1,400. Berikutan wujud aktiviti belian saham pada harga rendah susulan jualan baru-baru ini walaupun prestasi lemah di bursa serantau. Untuk meneliti prestasi FBM KLCI sepanjang minggu ini, kita bersama Syed Muhammad Kifni Syed Kamarudin merupakan Ketua Strategi MIDF Research. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Kifni kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Ini adalah hari terakhir untuk minggu ini. Mungkin boleh kongsikan kepada kami bagaimanakah prestasi FBM KLCI sepanjang minggu ini memandangkan beberapa faktor mungkin mempengaruhi pergerakan pasaran saham. Kifni, silakan.
Terima kasih. Terima kasih atas jemputan ke Awani. Indeks FBM KLCI susut sedikit sepanjang minggu ini dengan kejatuhan 5 mata kepada 1,407. Ini kemungkinan adalah akibat aktiviti pengambilan untung berikutan prestasi memberangsangkan pada minggu lepas yang menyaksikan indeks FBM KLCI naik sebanyak 34 mata, disokong pembelian oleh dana asing dengan belian bersih sebanyak 570 juta ringgit. Itu merupakan nilai belian bersih asing mingguan tertinggi semenjak bulan Ogos tahun lalu. Masukan dana asing ke dalam pasaran equity tempatan itu pula antaranya didorong oleh kenaikan ketara nilai ringgit berbanding dolar Amerika. Pada minggu lalu, ringgit meneguh sebanyak hampir 3.2% berbanding dolar Amerika kepada paras 4.52 dari paras 4.67 pada minggu sebelumnya. Dan pada minggu ini pula kita menyaksikan nilai ringgit agak stabil berbanding dolar Amerika kini berlega sekitar paras 4.54. Kelemahan dolar Amerika berbanding kebanyakan mata wang dunia masuk ringgit semenjak 3 atau 2 minggu belakangan ini adalah berikutan kepercayaan para pelabur bahawa Rizal Persekutuan Amerika akan menaikkan kadar faedah buat kalian terakhir di mesyuarat bulan Julai pada minggu hadapan. Sehubungan itu, pasaran hadapan kadar faedah atau interest rate futures market kini memberi kebarangkalian 99% bahawa Rizal Persekutuan Amerika akan menaikkan kadar faedah pada mesyuarat minggu hadapan dan 83% kebarangkalian bahawa ia tidak akan menaikkan kadar faedah pada mesyuarat berikutnya. Kepercayaan para pelabur bahawa siri kenaikan kadar faedah oleh Rizal Persekutuan Amerika semenjak bulan Mac tahun lepas sudah hampir pada penghujungnya adalah berikutan data ekonomi Amerika Syarikat terkini bagi bulan Jun yang berkaitan pekerjaan seperti non-farm payroll dan berkaitan inflasi seperti indeks harga pengguna CPI dan juga indeks harga pengeluar PPI yang menunjukkan kenaikan kurang dari jangkaan pasaran. Keputusan data ekonomi bawah jangkaan ini dilihat akan dapat mengurangkan tekanan terhadap atau keperluan bagi Rizal Persekutuan Amerika untuk menaikkan kadar faedah secara berganda pada masa hadapan. Dan sekali lagi, perlu juga dinyatakan bahawa walaupun indeks utama FBM KLCI yang mewakili syarikat-syarikat besar mengalami penyusutan sedikit akibat pengembalian untung sepanjang minggu ini, namun prestasi indeks saham syarikat-syarikat bersaiz sederhana yang diwakili oleh indeks FBM 70 masih menunjukkan peningkatan sepanjang minggu ini. Dan sekiranya kita melihat kepada prestasi indeks tersebut pada sepanjang tahun ini, kita akan juga dapat lihat prestasi lebih baik saham syarikat-syarikat bersaiz sederhana berbanding yang besar. Pada sepanjang tahun ini, indeks FBM KLCI telah turun sebanyak 5.9%, sebaliknya indeks FBM 70 pula telah naik 6.8%. Punca utama kelemahan indeks FBM KLCI sepanjang tahun ini adalah berikutan komposisi tinggi kaunter-kaunter perbankan dalam indeks tersebut. Sentimen terhadap saham-saham perbankan adalah agak lemah akibat kerisauan pelabur berhubung kegawatan keuangan di kalangan bank-bank di Amerika Syarikat dan Eropah semenjak beberapa bulan lalu. Namun kami menjangkakan prestasi nilaian atau valuation saham perbankan akan mengalami pemulihan, terutama selepas Rizal Persekutuan Amerika berhenti menaikkan kadar faedah kerana ia akan mengurangkan risiko atau downside risk terhadap nilai semasa aset bersih perbankan.
Pemulihan yang kukuh itu juga adalah harapan satu rakyat Malaysia. Jadi kaunter atau sektor mana yang mendahului dan mana yang mengalami kejatuhan?
Sepanjang minggu ini, tujuh daripada 13 sektor di pasaran saham tempatan didagang pada tahap yang lebih rendah. Indeks sektor kewangan, consumer, telekomunikasi, utility, tenaga, teknologi dan REIT mengalami kejatuhan. Manakala indeks sektor industri, peladangan, kesihatan, pengangkutan, pembinaan dan juga hartanah didagang pada tahap yang lebih tinggi. Sepanjang minggu ini, indeks sektor hartanah mencatat kenaikan terbesar dengan lonjakan hampir 4.2%. Perlu juga dinyatakan bahawa indeks sektor hartanah juga mencatatkan kenaikan terbesar sepanjang tahun ini dengan lonjakan melebihi 17%. Pelabur institusi tempatan merupakan pembeli bersih terbesar dalam kaunter-kaunter sektor hartanah sepanjang tahun ini. Dan semenjak 2 minggu kebelakangan ini, pelabur asing juga mula menjadi pembeli bersih dalam kaunter-kaunter sektor hartanah. Minat pelabur terhadap sektor ini mungkin berpunca dari nilaian atau valuation yang menarik kerana terdapat kaunter-kaunter yang diniagakan dengan nisbah harga berbanding nilai aset bersih di bawah paras satu. Di samping itu, perkembangan ekonomi makro yang kini didukung oleh permintaan domestik sekiranya berterusan akan lebih mencerahkan prospek pendapatan bagi sektor hartanah ini.
Baik, Hakim ni berbakikan 2 minit. Apakah jangkaan hala pergerakan pasaran saham dalam masa terdekat?
Maklum bahawa dolar Amerika adalah mata wang rizab utama dunia dan lebih penting lagi mata wang tersebut juga adalah sumber kecairan kewangan antarabangsa utama sedunia. Oleh itu, tindakan ataupun persepsi tindakan rizab Persekutuan Amerika akan memberi kesan kepada arah aliran kecairan kewangan antarabangsa. Baru pada minggu lepas saja kita dapat melihat bagaimana persepsi para pelabur bahawa Rizal Persekutuan Amerika akan berhenti menaikkan kadar faedah selepas bulan Julai ini sudah cukup untuk mengakibatkan pergerakan yang agak ketara dalam pasaran mata wang asing. Seperti dinyatakan tadi, nilai mata wang ringgit banyaknya melonjak pada minggu lepas dan kecairan kewangan asing bernilai lebih setengah bilion ringgit mengalir masuk dalam pasaran equity dan harga-harga saham bursa mengalami peningkatan. Kami menjangkakan bila mana persepsi tersebut menjadi realiti, kesan positifnya akan lebih ketara terhadap nilai ringgit, jumlah pemasukan kecairan kewangan asing dan juga harga saham tempatan. Oleh itu, sekiranya selepas mesyuarat Rizal Persekutuan Amerika pada minggu depan, pengurusinya mengeluarkan kenyataan yang tidak bersifat hawkish dan memberikan indikasi bahawa bank pusat tersebut tidak akan menaikkan kadar faedah lagi selepas mesyuarat bulan Julai ini, kita menjangkakan ia akan disusuli dengan trend kenaikan harga-harga saham yang lebih mampan. Pada masa kini, MIDF Research menjangkakan indeks FBM KLCI akan mencapai tahap 1,545 pada penghujung tahun ini.
Baik, sekali lagi saya ucapkan terima kasih kepada Syed Muhammad Kifni Syed Kamaruddin, Ketua Strategi MIDF Research kerana bantu kami untuk memahami bagaimanakah prestasi pasaran saham minggu ini dan apakah hala pergerakan saham untuk masa yang akan datang. Kita ke laporan berikutnya. Jenama kereta dari syarikat Tesla secara rasminya dilancarkan di Malaysia apabila sebuah model kenderaan elektrik EV diperkenalkan iaitu Model Y bagi pasaran Malaysia. Model kenderaan utility sukan SUV itu didatangi dengan 3 varian yang kini sudah mula ditempahan sejak beberapa hari lalu melalui laman webnya. Wartawan Hafizi Rosli ada laporannya.
Model Y RWD, Model Y Long Range AWD dan Model Y Performance AWD masing-masing kini di pasaran Malaysia dengan harga antara RM199,000 hingga RM288,000. Dalam majlis pelancaran di Ibu Negara pada Khamis, pengarah Tesla Serantau Isabel Fan berkata pihaknya menjangkakan penghantaran akan bermula seawal tahun depan. Jelasnya Model Y ini merupakan model SUV pertama direka dan dibina untuk pasaran luas termasuk Malaysia. Model ini katanya merupakan kenderaan yang sangat responsif, iaitu dengan daya pecutan 100 km sejam dalam masa 3.7 saat serta mampu mencapai jarak sehingga 533 km bagi setiap pengecasan. Sebelum ini, kerajaan mengumumkan pemberian insentif pengecualian fee lesen kenderaan motor LKM atau cukai jalan sepenuhnya kepada kategori kenderaan motor elektrik EV bermula awal Januari 2022 hingga akhir 2025. Dalam pada itu, Tesla turut melancarkan stesen pengecasan pantas atau supercharge station pertama di Malaysia, iaitu di pusat membeli belah Pavilion KL.
Tesla baru saja melancarkan Model Y, iaitu model pertama yang dibawa untuk pasaran Malaysia. Dan bila bercakap mengenai kenderaan elektrik EV ini, ramai yang tertanya di mana nak mengecas dan sebagainya. Dan selain daripada inisiatif daripada syarikat utility, Tesla juga mengambil kesempatan di sini untuk menyediakan juga stesen pengecas yang dipanggil sebagai supercharge station, dan di mana kalau kita lihat kepada kapasiti dan juga kemampuannya, stesen ini mampu mengecas sebuah kenderaan dengan jarak 120 km hanya masa 5 minit saja. Jadi begitu pantas ia dapat mengecas dan pastinya ia memberi keselesaan kepada pengguna dan juga menjimatkan masa mereka.
Tesla turut merancang untuk memperluaskan bilangan stesen pengecasan ini tidak hanya tertumpu di Lembah Kelang, malah di Johor, Pulau Pinang, Perak serta Negeri Sembilan. Ia selari dengan usaha kerajaan untuk menyediakan 10,000 stesen pengecasan menjelang 2025 di seluruh negara.
Dalam pada itu, dengan pelancaran model pertama kenderaan elektrik EV Tesla, ia membuka peluang dan memperdaya pembangunan teknologi dan infrastruktur kenderaan itu di Malaysia. Jelas Timbalan Menteri Perdagangan Antarabangsa dan Industri MITI, Liu Chintong, kemasukan Tesla serta jenama-jenama lain akan meningkatkan industri EV negara. Seterusnya akan memberi peluang kepada penciptaan peluang pekerjaan baharu.
Kerajaan bukan saja harap Tesla masuk, tetapi lebih banyak jenama EV masuk ke negara kita. Dan juga kita boleh wujudkan ekosistem yang lebih baik untuk charging dan untuk penggunaan EV. Tetapi bukan saja kita menumpu terhadap penggunaan, tetapi kita juga harap pembangunan industri EV dan pembangunan industri yang EV bawah, bukan saja kilang-kilang tetapi juga teknologi dan juga software. EV perlukan software. So ini adalah value chain ataupun rangkaian nilai yang kita harap boleh wujudkan dengan kemasukan Tesla dan juga jenama-jenama lain.
Chintong turut memaklumkan kerajaan terus mengalu-alukan mana-mana jenama EV untuk terus memasuki pasaran Malaysia. Dengan kemasukan lebih banyak lagi jenama EV ke negara ini, pelbagai infrastruktur boleh dibangunkan, seterusnya membantu negara dalam usaha mengurangkan pelepasan gas rumah hijau.
Dalam usaha memperluas ekosistem kenderaan elektrik EV di negara ini, pemasangan lebih banyak stesen pengecas EV adalah satu aspek yang perlu diberikan tumpuan utama. Menteri Pelaburan, Perdagangan dan Industri MITI, Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Abdul Aziz berkata, kerajaan menyasar untuk memasang 10,000 stesen pengecas EV menjelang 2025 dan pengecas supercharger Tesla akan dapat menyumbang kepada sasaran tersebut.
Bila bercakap tentang ekosistem EV, salah satu aspek yang dibangkitkan ialah keperluan nak tambah charger EV di seluruh Malaysia. Ialah pemilik EV ini bukan di Lembah Kelang saja. Sasaran kerajaan ialah untuk memasang 10,000 charging station menjelang 2025. Jadi, supercharger Tesla ini pastinya menyumbang ke arah sasaran tersebut. Kerajaan dah syaratkan Tesla mesti pasang sekurang-kurangnya 50 supercharger menjelang 2026 dan yang paling best 30% dia daripada supercharger sini mestilah terbuka untuk jenama lain. Maksudnya EV yang bukan Tesla pun boleh guna. Best kan?
Anda seorang usahawan PKS ingin meluaskan rangkaian bisnes, perlukan inspirasi dan idea? JIWA SME oleh Astro AWANI pada julung kalinya akan menjelajah merentas komuniti-komuniti PKS di Sabah Johor, Kelantan, Pulau Pinang dan Kuala Lumpur bermula Julai hingga November ini. Pelbagai aktiviti menarik seperti perkongsian ilmu, workshop dan persembahan selebriti tempatan menanti anda. Sertai kami pada 22 dan 23 Julai ini di Imago Shopping Mall Sabah. Untuk maklumat lanjut, layari www.jiwasme.com.my. Jiwa SME, gelanggang inspirasi usahawan. Baik, kita teruskan dalam segmen Jiwa SME di mana kita akan bawakan iaitu perkongsian kisah dan pengalaman salah seorang PKS, iaitu saya memperkenalkan itu tetamu kita yang sudah bersedia dalam talian, Datuk Dayang Khatijah, Datuk Patil merupakan Presiden IKS NITA. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Datuk kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Sebelum itu Datuk, sebagai PKS usahawan wanita mungkin yang telah berkecimpung dalam industri ini, mungkin Datuk boleh kongsikan apakah trend ataupun situasi usahawan wanita semasa ini?
Sabah, maklumat lanjut, layari www.jiwasme.
Menjemput kita pagi ini ya. Trend sekarang ini untuk usahawan saya rasa banyak ke digital, banyak ke media sosial. So I think we need to upgrade. Kita kena banyak memperbaiki dan mencari ilmu untuk because the trending is keep changing and it's fast. So untuk SME, IKS kita kena selalu bersiap sedia untuk perubahan-perubahan dan cara-cara marketing, cara-cara pembuatan yang lagi canggih. Because now as I see, perkembangannya adalah terlalu dynamic. So everybody have to catch up. InsyaAllah, with a good vibes, with good attitude, we can always be putting on track sebagai usahawan SME ataupun IKS. InsyaAllah.
Baik. Datuk, kalau kita nak lihat, kita dapat lihat iaitu wanita, kaum wanita, golongan wanita semakin mendapat nama di medan perniagaan, perdagangan. Jadi bagaimana kita nak terus perkasakan usahawan PKS wanita? Mungkin Datuk boleh kongsikan antara cadangan ataupun nasihat bagaimana?
Yalah, salah satu daripadanya ni, terima kasih Astro kerana membawa kami ke gelanggang yang lebih besar bersama media perdana seperti Astro. We need more exposure. We need more of what we can do, ya. Dan kita punya apa yang kita buat itu kita banyak boleh. I think the media social now play a very important part dalam terus memperkembangkan usaha kita, insya-Allah. Ya.
Nanti di sana, di Sabah, mungkin Datuk boleh kongsikan apa antara perkara yang akan disampaikan pada Jiwa SME nanti?
Ya, kita balik kepada title atau tajuk kita, Jiwa. I always believe keusahawanan ini adalah spiritual. Dia kena ada di dalam hati, dia kena ada di dalam minda. Sebab itu pada weekend ini, pada hujung minggu ini, kita cuba sematkan semangat bahawasanya sebagai usahawan ini bukan kita sekadar buat karipap, bukan sekadar buat produk, tetapi kita menjiwai perjuangan kita sebagai usahawan. Why? The big why behind kenapa kita jadi usahawan. So acara seperti Jiwa SME ini saya rasa bertepatan. Sebab kita kena menjiwai AKA ataupun fokus dengan apa yang kita buat. Dengan adanya nanti acara di Imago ini, saya rasa kita boleh memberi inspirasi, aspirasi dan semangat yang lebih kental kepada usahawan. Walaupun dia 2 hari, tapi saya rasa impact dia itu adalah ke arah rohania, spiritual sebagai usahawan. So kami di IKS NITA, we always believe in delivering soul, roh. Ini Astro datang dengan jiwa. Kami IKS NITA datang dengan roh. Kita harus ada roh dalam membuat apapun yang kita mau buat sebagai usahawan. Kalau kita tidak ada roh, tidak ada jiwa, kita akan jadi coklat. Now you see, now you don't. Sebab hatinya itu tidak begitu kental dalam perjuangan sebagai usahawan. InsyaAllah, with these 2 days, we hope to inject semangat keusahawanan yang kental kepada semua usahawan wanita dan usahawan di seluruh Sabah. InsyaAllah, kita akan buat santai, tapi kita mungkin akan mencapai dari segi jiwa dan spiritual sebagai usahawan. InsyaAllah, let's have fun.
Betul. Let's have fun seperti yang Datuk cakap bahawa kita harus menjiwai segala perkara yang kita lakukan. Mungkin bergerak ke hadapan, mungkin Datuk boleh kongsikan sedikit apakah harapan Datuk untuk lihat lebih ramai wanita di luar sana yang mahu berkecimpung dalam dunia ataupun bidang keusahawanan ini. Mungkin kita boleh cakap apa yang perlu ditambah baik daripada segi infrastruktur digital, seperti yang Datuk katakan tadi bahawa ini adalah antara trend terkini yang kita dapat saksikan.
Ya, saya amat, I have been doing this for the last over near 20 years untuk memperkasa usahawan wanita di Sabah. Dan terima kasih kepada kerajaan, agensi kerajaan, juga korporat dan macam Astro yang mengangkat kami. Sebenarnya kami ini adalah usahawan. So we have to do our part, and media kena buat part dia, kerajaan kena buat part dia. Semua ini akan membolehkan usahawan untuk bergerak maju ke hadapan. Ya, dan usahawan kena ambil inisiatif untuk juga expose diri ini. Ya, bukan jual diri tapi marketing kena kau-kau. Baru kita ada semangat. Because business is about networking. Business is about transaction. Ya, dan ini semua kita dapati pada trend masa sekarang ini digital. Digital ada, yang macam Astro buat physical di Imago, yang mungkin Imago itu akan bergegar. Sebab jiwa dan roh-roh yang ingin berjaya akan berkumpul di Imago pada 2 hari itu. Dan kita harapkan ini dapat memberi lagi semangat-semangat kental di kalangan usahawan ataupun orang yang mau jadi usahawan. Ya. Bersedia untuk menjadi usahawan, seperti Astro cakap, kita kena ada jiwa. If tidak ada jiwa, then we are kosong. Kalau kosong itu perjuangannya tidak kental. Mungkin kalau produk kita tidak laku, cepat merajuk. So no, this is I think Astro trying to do menjiwai keusahawanan itu sendiri. Dia rasa macam benda you tak nampak, tapi inilah yang menggerakkan kita, jiwa kita, roh kita sebagai usahawan. InsyaAllah we will deliver the best.
Betul-betul Datuk. Saya pun telah merasai semangat dan suntikan semangat Datuk daripada sini lagi. Walaupun kita cakap 2 hari, tapi seperti yang Datuk cakap, kita mungkin akan dapat merasai kesan yang lebih besar sekiranya setiap orang menjiwai dalam segala perkara yang mereka lakukan. Bab kata pepatah yang dikatakan oleh Michelle Yeoh, pemenang, iaitu pemenang pelakon wanita terbaik untuk Oscar, dikata, ladies, don't ever let anyone tell you you are past your prime. Dan sekali lagi saya ucapkan terima kasih kepada Datuk Dayang Khatijah Dato' Batial, merupakan Presiden IKS Anita, dan ini adalah segmen JIWA SME.
Lately ni banyak soalan pasal Astro Fiber kat social media. Apa kata I tolong jawabkan satu? Soalan ni dari Bella. Dia tanya, saya dah ada Astro. Kalau nak pasang Astro Fiber berapa? Kalau dah ada Astro, memang untunglah ambil Astro dengan Wi-Fi kencang sekali. Dekat situ memang jimat dah. Dan jangan risau, nak maintain channels boleh, tak nak lari bajet pun boleh. Tanya je, kita bincang. Contohlah kan, pack movies dengan jenama internet lain paling kurang pun sebulan RM225. Tapi dengan pack movies dengan Wi-Fi kencang boleh jimat RM30 sebulan. Banyak tu Bella. Layari astro.com.my/fiber untuk info lanjut tentang pack dan promosi terkini.
Sokong pasukan anda dengan hanya RM9.99. Kedah menyekat kemarahan para pesaingnya. Bintang pemain top gajah mengukuhkan pasukan mereka. Mara bersama dengan PAS Liga Malaysia. Stream ke semua perlawanan dalam HD. Liga Super di Astro Arena Bola dan Astro Go.
Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kauchi. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs. Market watch, industries, analysis and insights, we've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, for this week, we are actually on analysis examining the progressive wage model. That's right. Now, when we come to the progressive wage model, to start, it's essential to look at average income increases since 2010 to 2020. Now, what all of these facts and figures are going to be basically showing us is a 51.5% increase, while median wages for the same time frame stands at a 37.5% increase. So, while this may appear equitable on the surface, moving along, once we actually look at the current situation of course inflation from the base year 2010, what we're actually going to be seeing is the Rakyat's cost of living pain point. Suppressed wages cannot keep up with spiraling inflation. We are seeing 53.3% increases for food and non-alcoholic beverages, 26.1% for basic costs, housing, water, electricity, gas, and a 21.5% increase in transportation costs from 2010 till 2022. So that brings us to the progressive wage model, or PWM, a wage structure to uplift low wages of workers, especially in labor-intensive sectors like retail, food services, waste management, etc. Now, with anticipated increases in prices of daily goods by 5% to 20% in Q3, 2 short weeks away, this couldn't be more timely. And in line with addressing this, the Ministry of Economy is presenting the Madani government a policy paper for PWM in early August. In fact, Minister of Economy Rafizi Ramli suggested last week PWM would be one of the most quote-unquote unpopular reforms he would implement as a policymaker. Meanwhile, on Niaga Spotlight, we break down why PWM is actually a solid policy-making solution for reshaping the Malaysian economy's dependence on cheap labour while allaying cost of living pressures for those most in need. So, with that in mind, joining me online now is Lee Heng Gui, Executive Director, Socio-Economic Research Centre, SERC, under the Associated Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry of Malaysia, ACCIM. Good morning, Lee. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you. Good morning to you, Tamina.
Now, Lee, can I ask you to begin with how can a progressive wage model, or PWM, address the historical wage suppression issue that we have been having in Malaysia for some time?
I think it's a widely acknowledged problem that the low wages for the low category workers are reaching a stage where need government intervention. I think the government has started to intervene with the minimum wage order, which was enforced on January 1st, 2023. And now, coming to this year, this is the 5th year of implementation since we started the minimum wage in 2013. Yeah, I think the current minimum wage level for Malaysian workers now, and also including the foreign workers, 1,005. If you compare the period from the year we started until now, on average, the minimum wage increase is about 5.2% for those in the Peninsular Malaysia and about 6.5% for those in the East Malaysia. I think in a nutshell, you compare the period where we started to implement the minimum wage until now, the productivity of the workers has not increased significantly. It's only about increased by 2.3%. So now you look at the current minimum wage model, whether it's still a good model to help to uplift the wages of the low category workers. So I think people are toying the idea whether should we consider to implement something similar to Singapore progressive wage model, PMW. I think it could be a more appropriate and feasible wage growth model as it ties to the improvement of productivity and training, which under the PMW, there will be an annual increase for the workers, and that gives them opportunity to move up to the ladder, ladder of the skill of the career path. So that if they want to move higher, they need to go through a specific training skill and productivity improvement. So in simple principle, we call the working for what you want and you get what you work for. So I think it benefits workers because it map out a clear career pathway for their wages to rise along with the training and improvement in productivity and standards.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Lee. I think that's a great nutshell. And at the same time, we also should make a note of the fact that when it comes to corporate income to GDP ratio in Malaysia is at roughly 62%, one of the highest in the world, while employee compensation or salaries barely register at about 35% of that. So moving along there, looking at limitations of the PWM, the progressive wage model, and in particular, how can it overcome these two specific barriers, Lee? The first being the continuously increasing pool of low-skilled workers, and secondly, aging or aged low-skilled workers.
I think if you look at the whole concept PMW, there are a few limitations. I think you rightly pointed out there are two. First is in terms of whether you have to address the present of low-skilled worker. I think if you look back the root cause of where the wages now for the low category because of the large presence of the foreign worker in Malaysia. And there's also imbalances of bargaining power between the employer and employee. And as the government tries to balance out this, I think there is always some resistance from the employer. And the employer will say, okay, now I'm willing to pay for this certain level of wage. But whether the employee per se, have they show improvement in productivity to help the business to grow, to increase the profit, and then there's something a win-win situation between the two. So as we want to implement this progressive wage model to address the presence of low-skilled workers, then we need to synchronize it with the management and supply of the foreign worker worker, which is we are doing now. I think the government in due course will introduce a multi-tier levy, which means that in simple form, it's just to encourage people to reduce the dependency on the influx of the low-wage foreign workers in the economy. If you hire percentage of foreign workers, you have to pay a higher levy. So this is something that the government currently is working on that. Fully in due course it will be implemented, and before they implement the multi-tier levy, definitely I'm sure they will be engaging the unit, the employer, the industry, and work together and how best to implement with minimum disruption on the current operating environment of the business, given that we are still going through a period of uncertainty and wage increases, and also the cost of production has significantly increased over the past 2 years since the post-COVID pandemic. So on the second limitation in terms of the elderly or aging society, so I think one of the difficulty to implement the progressive wage model is how to encourage the elder workers to upskill. I think that's a bit difficult. I think certain elderly people would require a longer time, maybe a specified type of training module in order to help them to familiarize with the new techniques of the production. So that could involve more time and more resources to cater to the needs of this elderly worker. We are not going to be excluding them out from the whole progressive wage model. I think we have to be mindful to be inclusiveness, that everyone will be given a fair share to participate in the company and also in the economy. So I think definitely I believe the employer and the employee and also the government can work out a scheme which is tailor-made to support the elderly worker in the participation of this progressive wage model.
Yes, absolutely, Lee. Of course, because one size does not fit all, it has to go to industry-specific and then, of course, sector-specific. Now, one last area that I'd like for you to perhaps share with us, Lee, a productivity-linked wage system, or PLWS, which is a flexible, competitive wage system that establishes a closer link between wages and productivity or performance, is, of course, the ideal. How can this actually be achieved by putting us on the path towards PWM, the progressive wage model, first?
I think the chamber, we are the center, the independent think tank of the chamber. I think the industry, and including our chamber, has been emphasizing to the government that I think we need to work towards the productivity-linked, wage-linked system, which means that currently, if you look at the current minimum wage model, once in every 2 years they will review. Okay, if we decided to increase the minimum wage, everyone will get the same quantum of increase, regardless of their productivity improvement, regardless whether they are performer or not performer. So I think with the progressive wage model, which I already mentioned, it is something that allows everyone the opportunity to move up the ladder component of the PWN, which allowed you to be having a career path. Then you know a better job prospect, and also you have a sense of belonging. You know, that contribution to the company and to the society and to the economy, and it helped everyone to move up the ladder. Yeah, in the course of their career path. It's not something like minimum wage. Every 2 years you have an increment, so everyone gets the same. So there's no incentive for the employee to seek out, for pay increases, as long as they're willing to go for training, a specific module of training, and there will be specific level of wages for certain rung of the whole career path. Then you are motivated to go up higher. For example, to give you an example, like in the retail sector. In the retail sector, you have different category of the job spec, right? In terms of the job cluster, like your cashier, your retail assistant, or your senior cashier, or your retail manager, or retail supervisor. So under this progressive wage model, the tri-party three-party, like the government, the union, and the employer, to work together and decide for each level of this rung, what is the wage level and what sort of specific training they have to go through before they move up. So this is the incentive, the motivation for us to move up, for the workers to move up to the ladder. So I simplify it. I mean, the minimum wage the PWM is a progressive one, wage system.
Thank you very much for sharing all of that, Lee. And basically, that was Lee Hengui, Executive Director, Socioeconomic Research Centre, SERC, under the ACCIM, sharing with us a little bit more about how we can move towards this more progressive wage model in Malaysia. We take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Niaga Spotlight.
Betul ke dia dah resign?
Siapa yang resign?
Zara.
Zara?
Persoalan. Aku dah hantar surat resign Zara. Segala misteri kehilangan Zara dah selesai. Yang kau bunuh tu?
Saya sendiri nampak dengan mata saya, bos. Munirah dengan Ikram tengah bergaduh. Pasal something.
Kenapa awak jumpa Ikram?
Mampukah rahsia dipertahankan?
Kau tak kau cuma exit kat muka kau. Macam mana kau buat Zara? Bunuh!
Aku tak bunuh dia!
Saksikan Hijrah Jana di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
Pelanggan Astro, kini view premium boleh didapati di Pack Entertainment.
Okey, apa dah jadi ni? Nina mana?
Nina dah langgar undang-undang dimensi dia.
Akses ke semua view original bila-bila masa.
Di hati saya dia yang pertama. Apa yang kau suka, pasti aku tahu.
View premium kini boleh didapati di Pack Entertainment Astro. Layari laman web kami untuk maklumat lanjut. Stream ke semua aplikasi kegemaran anda di satu tempat. Astro Baharu, tak macam dulu.
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Well, on this week for Future Affairs, we look at green electricity tariff, the GET, and net zero 2050. Now, the green electricity tariff, GET, was first introduced back on January the 1st, 2022 as an opt-in program. It actually provides domestic and industrial consumers in the peninsula with the option of using electricity generated from renewable energy sources such as hydropower and solar plants to reduce their carbon footprint. Now, a new premium for GET will be introduced beginning August, marking an almost six-fold increase from the previous tariff of 3.7 cent per kilowatt hour to 21.8 cent. This is crucial as CO2 emissions have consistently represented approximately 78% of Malaysia's total GHG emissions, emitted primarily by businesses from direct and indirect activities. Yang Berhormat Nik Nazmi Nik Ahmad, Minister of Natural Resources, Environment and Climate Change, joined me in the studios to discuss the green electricity tariff, GET, and its role in steering Malaysia's wider net zero goals by 2050. Let's watch. YB Nik Nazmi, thank you so much for making time for us on Niaga Spotlight. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
All right, let's get started off. Now, YB, Malaysia's renewable energy transition requires roughly 637 billion ringgit in investment for us to reach our 2050 net zero goals. Now, how can the green electricity tariff, which is going to be launching in August, just 2 short weeks away, contribute to this?
Yeah, thank you. the GET or the Green Electricity Tariff has been around since 2022.
That's right.
But recently, I think it came in the spotlight when we revised the tariffs to 21.8 cents, which is the latest tariffs. And I think the point being is that we have to understand that going green, there's a price to it. We need to invest more, as you mentioned. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, they mentioned 637 billion ringgit that's needed for us to achieve our net zero goals by 2050. So only by allowing a premium to be paid for green tariffs, that will then help us to prepare the grid. It will help then to get more investors to come in and invest in more renewable energy projects, and that will then in turn accelerate our RE adoption.
That's right. And we're also going to be kickstarting the National Energy Transition Roadmap Phase 1. We've just received news by 27 July, which is next week, by the Ministry of Economy. Yep. What can you tell us about that, broadly speaking, insofar as investments go to kickstart this entire ecosystem? Yeah,
I mean, I think next week the Minister of Economy will announce about 10 projects, if I'm not mistaken, flagship projects related to the energy transition roadmap. But the bottom line is that by 2050 we are targeting 70% of our energy capacity to be coming from renewables. So that means solar, hydro, biomass, biogas, and possibly other sources, but the ones I mentioned primarily. So when we have that big target, that big number, currently capacity is 25%, but energy mix is much lower.
Correct.
If you combine hydro, solar, and biomass. So in order to reach that big target, so then we have to have the market in place, the market structures in place. We have to have the policies in place. One of the things that we've done since we've taken over under the new government, we've done a few revisions on the tariff, electricity tariffs in general.
Yes,
overall. So the move is towards more and more targeted subsidies rather than blanket subsidies that we have, which is really unhelpful in terms of the energy transition. Then we also have the GET. We've also at the same time relaxed on a lot of policies for people who want to take solar as an alternative. While the tariffs have gone up, especially for the largest consumers of electricity, or also for
industries versus households.
And also the richest households. What we've done is to then allow them to make it easier for them to resort to solar. For example, self-consumption, Celco. Previously, high voltage consumers of the NB, because they are very lucrative, were not allowed to do Celcos. Now they are. And for households, you can install as much solar as you want. So this sort of policy changes are helping us to have that energy transition. But obviously, the details, the projects that will be key for the energy transition will be announced next week. I'll be there along with YB Rafizi.
Sure, and we definitely look forward to that. Moving along, YB, looking in focus at the short-term goals for the Net Zero 2050, how is the GET rate hike significant for the broader transition? And I hope here we can address a couple of the common misperceptions that are already starting to cloud the market, such as, for example, it's only the wealthy or those who can afford to who care about the climate. Now, that's not too true, is it?
It's not too true. I mean, first of all, when we have this sort of policies, we have to look at other countries as well, because there is a lot of demand for green energy. Even in countries like Singapore, Australia, or the UK, the general rule is that green tariffs are at a premium compared to normal tariffs. Simply because because we provide the certification, the Malaysia Renewable Energy Certificate, and that's something that's very valuable, particularly for companies that are involved in the supply chain at the international level, and so they need to show that they are getting green energy. So that's where the value is. So if previously, in fact, it was much cheaper than conventional tariffs, then it just doesn't make sense. In fact, we had people who were simply subscribing to it, not really because it's green, but because it's cheap.
Correct.
You know,
that's right.
And
we've got to move away from that because it is not just
away.
going to cost us, but at the same time, it's about wider sustainability, right?
Correct. And you know, as I think I've mentioned earlier, is that, you know, in terms of our capacity, but especially in terms of our energy mix, you know, it's very, very low still, the renewable energy. So it's only by allowing that premium can we scale it up. It's the same reasoning that we have with regards to allowing renewable energy exports. That's another major policy change that this government has made. And simply because not to sell all our renewable energy, but to sell some of it because, let's give an example of Singapore.
All right.
Their tariffs are much higher than ours. So by that, then, you know, we can scale up our renewable energy sector at the same time. Because the problem, our major renewable energy is still solar. You know, there are other wind, for example, it's not really, at the current technology, it's not really feasible in Malaysia. You have biomass, hydro, electricity, and others. But when it comes to solar, the problem is it's intermittent, right? You only get it, the peak is actually only 4 hours, even with our climate. So you look at Philippines, they have invested a lot in battery storage. But why have they been able to do so? Because their tariffs are much higher than ours.
Exactly. So they already had that accessible funds available.
Correct.
And the interesting thing about, of course, solar energy is that, in fact, in just about an hour and a half of sunlight hitting the Earth in one day, that's actually the entire world's energy consumption. But it's about harnessing it correctly. Moving along a little more deeply, YB. Now, companies in Malaysia are also increasingly adopting ESG-related net zero targets, purchasing carbon offsets. How do you hope the GET tariff hike is actually going to encourage them to mainstream this a little bit more and that little bit faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the major complaints that we had when the GET was priced at such a low rate was that, and I announced this in February this year, the previous quota and the rates, was that it finished in a very short time, simply because simply because it was cheap, I guess, and it was also high in demand. So as a result, many companies came back complaining, saying that they are willing to pay more, you know, but they need to be able to get hold of the
guaranteed supply.
A guaranteed supply. And I think, to be fair as well, it was, you know, we are still new in this. I mean, many other countries are also still experimenting with green tariffs.
Sure.
We wanted to have a lot more companies, a lot more households to have to be able to have some green tariffs. But now that we are charging a premium and whatnot, you know, we will, I think, you know, we can allow more companies to be able to buy it, and they can afford to do so because it's in their interest to do so. You know, that again, with that certification that they have, you know, that's the valuable thing that for them to show their green credentials, because now that means that they also can sell their services or their products at a premium. Now with new legislations like in Europe, CBAM, that's coming in a few more years.
Correct.
You know, these certificates will be like, you know, it's valued like gold, you know, because simply, you know, Malaysia's target is net zero earliest by 2050. But many companies are talking about net zero or even net negative by 2030. Right, and so that's where
7 short years away. Yeah,
short years away, and we are a trading nation. We are very much involved in the supply chain of electronics and whatnot products, and that's where it's very valuable.
Yes, that's right. And of course, this also tacks with PwC's latest report, which shows that ESG investments globally, demand is actually outstripping supply about 30%. Every little bit we can make up actually contributes. YB, now, Malaysia currently generates a little over 1% of electricity annually from renewable sources. So what are the collaborations that you foresee which will require expanding in order for renewables capacity, infrastructure, as well as energy efficiency to all come in together, hopefully at the same time?
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about solar and biofuels, it's just above 1% in the energy mix. But let's not forget about hydroelectricity, which, you know, I know there's a huge debate, and I totally agree in terms of large hydro, mini hydro, but still, it's in terms of, it's much greener than, say, fossil fuels. So that's about another 15% hydroelectricity in Malaysia. I think that the challenge for us is that how do we make this transition and how do we make it as just as possible. The dirtiest fuel in the mix is by far coal.
Absolutely, and we're still heavily reliant on that.
We are still heavily reliant on coal, but we have also announced that there will be no new coal plants in Malaysia. We have a few that will expire. I think the first batch will expire in 2030 or 2031, and then the next few years there'll be a few more plants that expire. So we are also looking at possibility of either the ideal one is early retirement. But it's easier said than done. We have contracts, power purchase agreements that we have signed with the IPPs. But there's also another route which is called mothballing the coal plants, and that was the path taken by, for example, Germany and I think China. So Germany, for example, rather than closing down, and this is the science of it, right? So if you totally close down a power plant, it's very expensive to restart it, to get it running again, and so for it to generate electricity. But you can mothball it where you keep it just operational, minimally, the turbines running and whatnot, with generating very little electricity. But if the case arises, and in Germany's case, it was the Ukrainian war, where they then needed electricity from other sources other than gas as the prices spiked up, then they could resort to those coal plants as an emergency. And that may be practical for a country like Malaysia, where we are still a developing country, rather than totally early retirement of all our coal plants. So, at the end of the day, for us at the government level, we have to allow the market to work to enable renewable energy sources to come into play in a big picture.
Exactly.
There are a lot, previously there was a lot of red tape, the policy was not favorable. There is a lot of fear, to be fair. We've seen there's
a lot of skepticism as well, which is why it's so important to bust all these myths surrounding.
Definitely, but one of the I think genuine concerns is on the grid, right? And the grid has to be ready. If you just put in a lot of this intermittent energy into the grid, and the grid is not ready, we've seen, I think Vietnam, they've had a problem with their electricity supply. Even in the UK, there's a huge curtailment of wind and solar when the market or the grid is not ready for it. So I think these are things that we need to work out properly. The government plays a big role, but ultimately, we believe that we create the economics for it and the business environment for it, and then the investment and the private sector will come in for this to happen.
Yes, absolutely. Allowing for that easy adoption at different levels of society, beginning, of course, with the top players. Just to end out the discussion, YB, can I ask you about perhaps relevant models? Globally speaking, for example, Brazil is one of the top 6 producers of renewable energy, as well as for their own domestic consumption. And they have a climate really similar to ours, also dependent on solar as well as hydro. Any key takeaways that we could perhaps learn from them?
Yeah, I think our approach has always been to have an open perspective on these things. We know that this is a very nascent technology, renewable energy, and I think Brazil, they are a major player. If you talk about Southeast Asia, I would give credit to Vietnam. Even with the challenges that they face, but they've really gone big on solar. Philippines have done well in terms of battery storage and solar as well, and they're also talking about energy transition. How do they get out from their coal plants?
Correct.
Indonesia obviously is another major recipient of the Just Energy Transition Plan. So I think obviously those looking at countries at our stage of development is easier, because we know that we need a just energy transition. Energy transition full stop doesn't work for us, because we have people who...
So many moving parts to it.
Many moving parts. And we have been suppressing our tariffs for so long. And it's part of the whole economic structure. Why were tariffs low is to attract investors. Also, we wanted to attract investors by allowing our workers to be paid low wages. And again, in turn, with tariffs being low, then they can afford to be paid low wages. But now, as this thing started to change, you know, and
reversing
we also,
that little domino, right?
Yeah, it's a domino thing, and we want to move out from it. And as I said, I mean, factories come to me and complain, and I tell them, we can't afford to compete in terms of low-cost economy anymore. And they did complain. It was a lot of complaints. I increased the tariffs by about 400%, the surcharge.
That's right.
But eventually, what they did was now they are adopting more energy efficiency measures. They're installing more solar, right? And it's simply because the mechanisms are there. So I think it can be made to work. Obviously, we want to make it gradual. We want to make it targeted. We believe that there's still segments of society that needs to get the subsidy.
Yes,
one hand
that's
or another,
correct.
whether it's in the bill or whether it's in the form of cash transfers. I mean, that can be worked out. But we do know that's something that we have to bear in mind. But at the same time, you know, I'm telling the industries in Malaysia, the utilities in Malaysia, is that we can't be complacent anymore. We are blessed with sunshine. We are blessed with hydro. We are also blessed at being at the center of ASEAN. We forget that one of the things that make renewable energy work is by having a greater grid interconnection. ASEAN has been talking about ASEAN Power Grid for many, many years. But so far, what we've done is from Laos to Singapore. Malaysia and Singapore has bought hydroelectricity from Laos. But there are other opportunities, Peninsula to Sumatra, the long talked about Bakun, Sarawak to Peninsula, and so on and so forth. And you know, within Borneo there are some interconnections. So I think that is where Malaysia is at that center of ASEAN, and we can really leverage on that, and that can then have a positive impact for our energy transition.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, YB Nik Nazmi. And that, of course, is YB Nik Nazmi Nik Ahmad joining us on Niaga Spotlight. That's all we have time for today. We'll see you again next week with more business analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.